going to run through too much detail if we're talking about color theory. What I will do is kind of review a little bit, but also talk about how this ultimately pertains to how you would approach these sort of abstracted ideas in a design class and apply them to more of a painterly approach. So obviously you're all familiar with the color wheel. It's very simple, right? If you haven't, you probably want to memorize your complements, because the foundation of your success as a painter really does reside in the little bits of memory and recall that you have about A, how to mix, and B, what your complements are. And I'll talk about why that's so important in a bit. But basically, if we separate the spectrum in warm colors and cool colors, it helps out a lot when we're applying a sort of visual logic to how we see and perceive light. Now, in your palette, I ask that you have, and I'll just reiterate here, 2 different types of reds, 2 different types of yellows, and 2 different types of blues. Remember? If you look at them and you look at them closely, those 2 different types of red, one is a crimson, and one is just sort of a flat basic red. That flat basic red would be considered a warm red. But the other one has a slight purpley tone. That crimson is a little deeper, a little darker. It's more like blood, right? And so we're going to refer to that as a cool red. And I know it seems counterintuitive to refer to a logically warm color as cool, but it is. And so the more you sort of get used to that notion that every color has a temperature, the better off you'll be. And you all know this sort of general spiel about color theory, RGB and CMYK. So that's additive color and subtractive color. So if you only use light, if you shed all of the primaries, which using light actually isn't just red, yellow, and blue, it's blue, red, and kind of a green. If you shine them all in the same place, you're going to get white light. But if you use the subtractive form of color, which actually implements paint or pigment, and you mix them all together, red, yellow, and blue, you're going to get something that's close to black. Or at least in the logic of printmaking, when you have that much control over the pigments that you utilize. So I've just got some more, like here's cool, if you look in the middle area there, your cool spectrum, your warm spectrum, your bright spectrum, your dark spectrum, your saturated, and then your desaturated. And we're going to talk about how to do those things in your palette today. So intensity plays a major role in how you understand the success or aesthetically successful picture making. If you have high intensity colors, basically that just means that they're not desaturated somehow. And you can desaturate colors one of 2 ways: by adding black and white, not at the same time, black or white, or adding its complement, okay? Adding its complement. And we've got a whole system. Johanny Ten wrote this wonderful, wonderful book about, color interactions, using basic color theory to see how we perceive color in the natural world visually, so that it either makes very clear sense to us or it might agitate us. And so these rules that were developed are based foundationally in culture. And so I'll zoom in a little bit and I'll read these out to you. Green is typically associated with all things that are fresh and calming, very organic. Blue is typically associated with the tranquil, orderly, harmonious. Purple is generally associated with wealth. It was the color of the monarchs. It's generally very artistic, and it's generally considered eccentric. So as I go through these, I want you to think about this being a Western connotation, okay? Because if you think about the color white, in the Western regions, we would refer to white as sort of purity, as nothingness, right? However, white is the color that's mostly associated with death in the East. And what do we associate with death? Black. So yellow is typically associated with cheerful, emotions. It's inspired. Orange is generally exotic. Red is passionate. If you paint your dining room red, you will have a kind of psychosomatic response of hunger. So you actually do have physiological responses to seeing color. Yes, of course, they are affected by our cultural notion of that color. However, you will actually have a physical response. When they pick up drunk people and the police put them in a holding cell, it has been shown throughout studies that if you paint that holding cell pink, it will calm people down, physiologically and psychologically. So their pulses will lower, their breathing will slow, and they will become docile. Gray is generally very modern, and this is an achromatic gray, so no color in there other than black and white. Black can be associated with the artistic and sensitive, of course. It's considered very sophisticated. Brown is very neutral, and of course white is, in the West, associated with innocence. So I'll zoom out for that. Sorry, it was hard to read there. So as we think about methods in painting, the next assignment will deal with sort of multiples, but not of the same thing. But a great exercise to really understand color and light is to paint the same thing over and over and over again, but not in the same way, right? To apply different color combinations and palette orientations in order to achieve a full extension of mood, tone, and cultural association. And I've just got a page illustrating sort of the difference between neutrals, and we'll talk about that at length as we move. Okay. So simultaneous contrast has to do with you taking a color, any color, placing it on another color, and seeing how they interact. Okay? It is the science of interaction. They will be the same color, but the color that is contextually what it is placed on typically will inform how you read that top color, right? So if you look at the two yellows over to the far right, one looks more intense than the other. Is that not true? And if you look at the two blues in the upper left-hand corner, what you might see is a little bit of vibration in one of them and not in the other. One is easier to read in edges. So the blue against the blue is very clear and crisp, whereas the blue on the yellow feels A, more green, and B, feels like a softer edge. Those all play a role in how we can actually make naturalism happen in painting. And so the more you understand those, the better. You can also make achromatic grays feel like they actually possess a temperature by the context in which you put it on. And so there's all these exercises that go back in history that deal with simultaneous contrast. And why is it important? Well, if, say, you're a designer, right? By using and understanding the manipulation of these colors, you can create certain effects. There are colors that are going to be easily read, the far color on the right there. In the middle and then in the left, they're going to become very difficult. A couple of years back, there was this trend of having text on t-shirts that created vibration and that were difficult to read. And they often sort of referenced either dyslexia or drunkenness, what the text was reading. But it was using that to great effect in order to sort of make a visual pun, right? So here we've got some examples of what happens when you do these things in very clear form, utilizing simultaneous contrast. So the rule of thumb is you can use completely opposing temperatures as long as there is a lot of contrast. If you use entirely different temperatures, even if you use complements, they don't have to be complements, but if you use entirely different temperatures but they're the exact same value and intensity, you will really irritate your viewer. So you see that vibration one? They're the exact same value. So if I took a photograph of that and I turned it into black and white, you wouldn't really be able to read that well because there's no contrast and they're the same intensity. Do you understand? So these are things to sort of commit to memory. Otherwise, you're going to create images like this, which are perfectly interesting, and I would definitely hang that painting up, but I would know that every guest that walked into my dining room might have a little bit of an upchuck response, right? The longer they look at it. So as you utilize these color interactions, if you take, say, a neutral gray and you place it on a color, what will happen is is it will create a kind of visual temperature, or it will create a contrast that doesn't actually exist. So what we have illustrated here is obviously the same gray put on purple and yellow, and one appears darker than the other. You see that? So the gray on the right appears far darker and smaller in square structure than the one on the purple. So as you sort of become more aware of this, the more you can utilize these as a design strategy. Oopsie, I'll delete that. Oh, nope, I don't want to do that. Sorry about that. So we'll move that so I can read it. So successive contrast is where the first color is viewed and then another, right? So what can happen if you fix your eye steadily on one color and then you quickly replace that color with a different one, it will appear as though it's a different color. So this is all just sort of fun and games in terms of picture puzzle making, and you can play with that till the cows come home. So if you reverse contrast, also known as assimilation, the lightness of the white or the darkness of the black may seem to actually move. So you can actually create literally the effect of movement by utilizing this fun little arrangement. What happens when we take small particles or small shapes or small lines of differing colors and we place them close to each other, what we have is a phenomenon called optical mixing. So they will appear to create either a tone or a mixture of colors. And we've seen that a lot when we think about like pointillism, right? So modern contemporary artists are actually still using this effect of optical mixing, one of which is known as Chuck Close. Chuck Close, until recently, has been part of the whole cancel culture thing because he was, one of the Me Too guys. But he creates very, very large portraits of his friends and loved ones and well-known figures through this interaction of color called optical mixing. So here's a close-up of what one of his paintings might look like. And so it's gridded out. And of course, if we zoom in, what we see these colors to be are essentially just tiny little abstract circles. Circles, one laid over another color in varying temperatures in order to create a pictorial whole that makes sense as you move away. Here's another one of his works. And here's a detail of her mouth. This can also be used in embroidery. There are people doing a sort of photorealist embroidery approach today. It's considered painting because it's on canvas and it utilizes color. And I can't remember the name of the artist, but I could probably easily find that for you. And why this is important is because when you're trying to create a painting that ultimately yields a kind of effect, whether that be psychological, emotive, physiological, it can simply just be a tone or a mood. You want to know how to manipulate that color so that you're not just simply constrained to only what you see. What you can do as a painter is you can take what you can see and you can turn it up. You can turn it up to such a degree that you're really having an engagement with your audience that is a dialogue about what it is you're trying to convey. And it can be a back and forth.